Welcome to the K2 Sales Podcast. I'm your host, Karen Kelly. Every week, I'll be sitting down with a sales executive where they'll share their stories and experiences that produce game-changing results. Let's be honest, sales can be a tough game. I'm sure at some point, we've all delivered a less than stellar demo, been ghosted by a client or two, and sometimes maybe we did more talking than listening. And that's where I can help. The stories and insights our guests share can be applied to your own business, your territory, or with your team, so you're not reinventing the wheel. Our weekly tactics and strategies help you get out of your head and start creating your own path towards game-changing results. The goal of this show is to share game-changing stories that our guests are experiencing with themselves, their team, or what they're seeing in the industry. Now, in our current environment, companies are forced to pivot their strategy. There's an increased number of stakeholders involved in decisions, and there's greater risk. So the process of strategic decision-making at an executive level becomes more important. And I'm excited to be discussing that today and the impact it has on you as a leader, the company culture, and the overall organization. And to help me have this discussion, I'm delighted to have Gerry Stefanatos to the show. Welcome to the podcast, Gerry.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Excellent. My pleasure. Well, listen, Gerry, you started off, many years ago in healthcare, and you ended up as a general manager of Pfizer Essential Health. So maybe just to give us a little bit of background, walk us through what that leadership journey looked like for you, so some of us can see who want to emulate that, what it took to get to where you are today.
Okay, well, nice to be here again. Happy to share that story with you. It started in 1988 in healthcare, so quite a long time ago. I started with Abbott Labs and worked through a variety of sales and marketing positions the first 10 or 12 years, primarily in the Nutrition Division, which was a super fun business to grow up in because there were lots of elements of primary care, hospital, and retail that were married together. So it was a great exposure to the healthcare industry. Did a corporate sales function for a little while. And then in the year 2000, Abbott had their business structured within 4 business units in Canada. And one of those business units was the Hospital Products Division. And so that was my first, big leadership position, if I can call it that, as a director of the Hospital Products Division. A number of years later, that business was spun off, and an entity called Hospira, separate from Abbott, was established. I had the opportunity to lead the Canadian entity and establish our presence in Canada at the time. And then at one point in time, I assumed responsibility for Latin America as well, which was a pretty big geographic footprint. And a number of years later, I added Australia and New Zealand to the Canadian responsibility. So it was a pretty neat opportunity to get to operate in some different geographies as well. And then in early 2015, Pfizer purchased Hospira, and I was fortunate enough to be offered the leadership position for the integrated company in Canada. So smaller piece of geography, obviously, but a much bigger piece of business. And so I was very fortunate. I retired almost 3 years ago, May 2018. So spent 30 years in the industry, had an opportunity to work for some pretty wonderful organizations with some pretty amazing people. And some pretty cool parts of the world. So that's kind of my journey, and at least the bigger milestones as to where I went.
Those are some huge milestones. Thank you for sharing, Gerry. And what great geographical reach you had. Both, I'm sure there was some personal time you were able to take advantage of on your travels, I would imagine.
Yeah, there were actually some very interesting travel times. I tell you, discoveries for me, Argentina was just a fabulous place. I just loved it there. And Australia, New Zealand is a pretty beautiful part of the world too. So had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time there with my family as well, which was a lot of fun. So we still go back whenever we have the opportunity, whenever travel is permitted.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yes, Argentina is on my bucket list for sure. So thank you for sharing, giving us a little bit of insight as to what got you to where you were. And in terms of the conversation today, I kind of want to take it in 3 areas. And if we think about just leadership, if you could start off by defining it, and then we're going to break it down a little bit more and look at whole leadership. So as a leader, how do you balance those hard and soft skills? And then finally, we'll look at leadership and its impact on the overall company culture. So, in your opinion, Gerry, like what does good leadership look like to you?
Well, I would say there's probably many facets, at least from my perspective, and people that I've looked up to, and attributes that I thought were really important. I would say high level of integrity. I mean, I should probably start by saying, the intellectual horsepower required in those jobs is a given, right? So, I won't call that one out, but certainly you need some smart people that are able to balance many different variables and issues and understanding to be able to decipher what's important and not important. So that's kind of a given. But I would say from a more personal attribute perspective, high level of integrity, super important. I would say people that are very thick-skinned, able to take some of the issues and problems that they have to deal with and deal with them in an appropriate fashion. I mean, for me, one of the elements that was hugely important was being able to network in the organization appropriately. And what I mean by that is being able to operate with the senior level executive leaders on their basis and communicate and work the way they would like to. And then also be able to work in levels of the organization that report into you and be able to understand their issues and challenges and be able to communicate with them. Communication skills, very, very important in this day and age. So I would say that's also a very important attribute. Adaptability, I tell you, over the 30 years in the industry, the way things changed, the drivers of what were important to our businesses in 1988 were very different than in 2018. And so, maintaining a learning mentality. I heard somebody mention a quote earlier this morning that I thought was pretty cool. And it was, don't let your schooling interfere with your education. And I think it was some famous US author that might have said it. But, that's an important piece. You have to learn. You have to continue learning the elements that were important to you uh, at one stage in your career that led to success aren't necessarily the pieces that are going to be important moving forward if the circumstances are different. So adaptability is also an important one. So I'd say those are probably the key elements that I would say define a strong leader.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think, Gerry, one of the biggest misconceptions is people feel that what got them there is enough, but it really is not enough to get them to that next
Yeah,
level.
yeah, I think that's a hugely important piece because you see it in a lot of people that have had success and they've done it a specific way and want to use that same formula and apply it to things that need to be done that circumstances and environment might be very different that require a different mindset, different skill sets. And so, being open minded to that is an important element of leadership. Certainly, I agree.
And the pandemic has shown us all that. I mean, we've had to adapt, right? So if communication wasn't a strength or something else, we had to make it a strength, right? So sometimes it's by choice, and other times the decision is made for us. And some are choosing to, upskill and bridge the gap and take advantage of those higher positions, and others just are not, unfortunately.
Yeah, agreed, agreed. I'm not envious of leaders in this environment right now. An important part for me was always to be able to, the personal part of connecting with people is hugely important. And, how you're able to bridge that gap even via the way we're communicating and through video conferencing and not have the ability to be able to connect with people or at least connecting with people with a very different means. I'm likely guessing is leading to a lot of challenges for sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, communication plays a huge role. And I think it's also important to understand, like everyone has a preferred, style of communication, and just really understanding like what your audience prefers or what works for them. I think otherwise, the message or the way you're informing them may not resonate, and you may not actually get out of them what you're looking to.
Yeah, agreed. I would expect that that's probably a pretty big challenge. I'm sure there's likely some best practices, and people are learning, and people are adaptable. So the strong leaders
Hmm.
are find ways to be able to touch people in this different environment. But agreed, certainly probably a pretty big challenge for a lot of people.
And I noticed you said the strong leaders, and I would agree that, and not the weak leaders, but those who are maybe not as invested in their people, maybe they're not taking as much effort towards communicating. And especially times now when people are struggling, and really leading with empathy is very important. So I think communication is always important, but those who are doing it effectively now and genuinely, I would say, are better serving their team than those who are not.
Yeah, agreed. Carving out the time, even at the best of times, in communicating to your organization, given everything that's going on, and everybody's very busy, the jobs are very busy, so it's an effort. It's you have to plan it. You have to be very purposeful in how you do that. And what I hear from a lot of colleagues in this environment is the things that you were able to do and just get up and walk to somebody's office and have a conversation now require scheduling via Zoom, and their agendas are full from morning through night. So carving out the time to be diligent and purposeful from that perspective, I could see would be very challenging in this environment.
Yeah, and that's my words of 2021 is intentional and purposeful. And just for that reason, it's like we have such limited time now that we have to, we don't get it back. So if we're not adding value, if we're not preparing in advance and really saying like what's the best approach here, then we're kind of wasting people's time. Okay, so those are all great points. And in your experience, what fundamentals? So you shared a number of things, but are there fundamentals that continue to exist to provide the foundation of good leadership? So it's almost like things that don't go out of style. These are just the pillars that are always there. Is there anything that come to mind when you hear that?
Yeah, I think where I was starting, the intellectual horsepower piece, I think if I can drill down on that one a little more, I think one of the key fundamentals for strong leaders is you really have to have your arms around the business. I mean, you really need to know the goings on of what are the key drivers of that are impacting your business, being able to establish a vision and engage your organization to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the key fundamentals. All the other attributes are great, but if you don't understand the business, you don't understand the drivers of the business, you don't understand where the business is headed, you can't provide a vision for the business that engages your organization, then I think it's all for naught. And that to me was always a key fundamental. And not only for myself as leader in the different situations that you found yourself in, but even for your leadership team. I mean, people really need to buy into that. And, my sense was, and I don't want this to sound derogatory, but at least in our industry and the positions that we had responsibility for, we were a commercial organization. And so the commercial organization needs to set the pace for everything that's happening within the different countries. And so I thought that was a very important element in how all the support areas can dovetail to support what those commercial goals need to be. Now, for sure, there's always operational goals that might not necessarily be aligned with the commercial goals and might have I shouldn't say responsibilities, but impact in how you operationalize different things. But at the end of the day, it all needs to come together somehow. And I always saw that as the commercial leader's responsibility, really setting the pace for how things get done and being able to engage the rest of the organization to support those objectives. And a part of that too is as I talk through it a little more, is engaging the corporate organization as well, because people might be listening to this and you know we weren't CEOs of a complete entity. We were connected to another part of the organization, and so that's a very important element of it, to understanding the objectives of where your corporate organization is going and translating that into successful strategies and tactics on a local basis is an important piece. And so it all kind of, at least in my mind, all fits together in what I call setting the pace for the organization.
I think that's great, and it does make a lot of sense when you think about like the helm of it, or that top tier. Everything has to feed back into that, right? And if there's not that level of confidence and conviction at that level, think about all the business units or other drivers that are feeding into that, and they're doing it with uncertainty or doubt. And again, that's going to transfer downstream, and then the execution is going to be, just not fully there. So I think what you said, everything that applies to that level, that intellectual horsepower has got to be there, that self belief, that vision, and it's almost like if I don't know where we are now, like that current state, I have no idea where I'm going to take you. So it's kind of like, let's just take stock of where we're at, know the people, know what we're dealing with, because only then can I make an informed strategic decision that's going to impact many people. So when you're making that decision, it's not just one, you're going boom, boom, boom. These are the levers or the people or the departments that are impacted. So I would imagine, that takes a lot of time and consideration.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a whole organization exercise. So, I didn't mean to minimize the impact of the complete organization and make it sound like the most important pieces are the commercial piece. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I tell you, that was a huge learning from me when I became the director of the hospital products division. And, I had grown up through the commercial organization, different sales and marketing positions, and never really had an appreciation for what finance did, for what IT did, what supply chain did, what customer service did. And I know that might sound silly, and it does sound silly sitting here now and looking back at the learnings of things that learnings, I guess, is the appropriate word as you assume more senior positions. But at that time, it really became apparent to me, especially when we spun off the hospital products division to create Hospira in Canada, the support that was required from all these entities, the foundation to the business that was required from all these entities within the business. And commercial objectives are all for naught if you don't have an appropriate foundation to build off of. And so, much to what you said, the integration and understanding of how all those pieces fit together is hugely important to be able to do that successfully.
So, what would you say, Gerry, if someone is, in a similar situation and they're kind of looking at things in a silo, and maybe they're new to leadership and they're not, they're aware of supply chain finance, but what do you have any suggestions as how they can kind of reach out to them, get insights as to what's important to that department, so that then when they are reintegrating, this is where the kind of the selling comes in. Like, how can I sell them to join me, or what's in it for them to join me? So, is there any thoughts on that? What you would share for those in a leadership position?
Yeah, I would tell you the ability to do that varies on the size and complexity of organization that you operate in. So, I went through numerous exercises as such with Hospira, which, although a fair-sized global organization, I mean, we were still relatively small and very focused, and we had a limited number of portfolios, business portfolios that we were supporting. So it was much easier to engage other or parts of the organization into what those objectives were. And I would tell you, the strategic planning exercise, or whatever you would call it in your business, the planning component, and I'm not talking about the financial component of your planning, but the actual strategic uh, operational planning that you would go through. I mean, you need to engage everybody to be able to execute on that part. It can't just be a commercial entity. You need to have voices from many parts of the organization involved. And so I think that's the first initial step, so that everybody understands at least directionally where the business is going, the impact that it'll have in other areas of the organization, and how you can dovetail all those efforts so that everybody's moving in unison towards one set of objectives. In a world like Pfizer, there's a lot of competing organizations. So there were numerous commercial operations working under one roof that were dependent on a limited number of support areas. So, for example, we had one supply chain organization that was responsible for all the businesses. We had one customer service organization that was responsible for all the businesses. Similarly, finance and IT and whatnot. So the complexity of being able to balance all those pieces is a much more cumbersome effort in larger, more complicated organizations. And again, though, the answer is still the same. You need to engage those people, make them part of your planning process. Then you as well have to understand the complexities of where they're operating, because they're balancing other objectives and requirements from other pieces of business. So you have to figure out what the priorities are, and what's important to you for that point in time might not necessarily be important for them at that point in time. So having an enterprise-wide view of what's important for an organization of that size is important. So you need to be able to balance those pieces off. So, I think size of organization really has an impact on how you end up executing on some of those elements.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the theme that I'm getting from when we started talking is really managing the people. Because when you're trying to manage business units and bring them together and understand what's going on, behind these business units are people, right? And I think when, in a individual contributor role, we're not dealing with people as much. We're producing results on our own. But now you have to understand what is it going to take to engage the folks in finance? What's important to them? And I just think, you're pulling levers that are emotionally charged, and that at the end of the day, they're people, right? So I think a lot of what you're saying is you have to understand how people tick, what's important for them, so that you can create that alignment and all be going in that same direction.
Yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly. I mean, communication is really a big part of it. In fact, the only part of it, but active communication. Like you need to be a good listener, and communication doesn't just mean me telling you. I have to listen to what you're telling me as well and try and understand. So, active listening and trying to reconcile and balance is hugely important to the success of organizations.
I'm so glad you said that, Gerry, about active listening, because I feel now, and this is at all stages, not really leaders, but I feel that active listening is so important, and people need to feel heard, and you holding space for them and showing them that, I genuinely care what you're going to say, and we're listening to understand, but most people are listening to respond. And so I'm really glad you said that, because I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, I agree. I like the way you said that. You should be listening to understand, and, most people's reaction. And we all, when you get into defensive situations, it's a knee jerk reaction that everybody has. You have to be very conscious of, trying to listen to understand as opposed to listening to try and rebuttal. I mean, that's a very different, very different perspective on how you end up communicating and listening to what other people are telling you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question kind of veered off into its own little playground, which I love. But we started off talking about the fundamentals, kind of the things that don't go out of style or time. And you mentioned, really setting the pace and knowing where you are. Is there anything you would add to that?
Well, I think the part that's very important is really doing some sort of strategic planning. I think where we had started this discussion, I think we might have mentioned earlier, is really taking a pause at some point in time when either you're assuming new responsibilities or something problematic is happening in your business or there's some change that requires you to do so. But, I think the important part is that on a fairly regular basis, and whatever that means within your organization, you really need to take a pause and make sure the activities and the strategic imperatives you laid out for your organization are the most important ones. And that requires very a very expansive view on how you set out the most important strategic imperatives. I mean, you really have to have an understanding of the environment you're operating in, and especially within our industry, it's a highly regulated industry. There's a lot of government involvement from a regulation perspective. There's a lot of policy initiatives that impact us. You really have to have a good understanding from that perspective. I would also say having a really good understanding of your competitors is hugely important, and the competitors that you don't necessarily see coming. There's a real cross section of tech oriented people that are coming into healthcare that's going to have an impact in how this business operates moving forward. On a fairly regular basis, Amazon is indicating that they're going to enter into new businesses all the time. Pharmacy is an area that's been very important to them. If you don't think that's going to be disruptive, think again. All the wearables, and you have a lot of tech companies looking in that space. If you don't think that's going to be disruptive to how our products end up being used, think again. So there's a lot of pieces that aren't necessarily the traditional people that you would be competing against that potentially are going to have an impact. And so, those are all pretty important pieces. And I think you have to be reflective of what's inside as well, because coupling back to the adaptability discussion that we had earlier, markets are moving very, very quickly, and you have to be able to assess and take audit of what you have in your house. Like, are you appropriately structured to achieve the objectives you've laid out? Do you have the skill sets? Do you need to bring anything new on board to operate in these new markets? So it needs to be, I mean, at some point in time you need to put some stakes in the ground and say these are the strategic imperatives that I've laid out for my organization. But it's an iterative process. Like, you need to very regularly come back to it and give yourself marks on, are you making progress? Is it still the right thing to be doing? And so it's fairly dynamic from that perspective. And again, linking back to the fundamentals of leadership, I see that as really one of the core things that leaders need to be doing, and it's part of setting the pace for the organization.
Wow, so much to unpack there. Really great stuff, Gerry. I love the pause. And I think just what you said, if you tie it back into that first one of setting the pace, like think of a runner, they can set the pace, but at a certain point they have to pause and check in. And just like the things you said, check in on the competition, check in on yourself, and just that reflection, what's going on. Because I think sometimes people are going too quickly. And I always say, sometimes we need to slow down in order to speed up. And that's what you're just saying here is that pause. But when you think about the reflective, like a lot of where I see there's room for improvement is that self-awareness piece, and just looking at your, like taking the time to reflect and just kind of getting a bit vulnerable and say, okay, how did that go there? Did I pull that trigger too quickly? Did I engage these people enough? Was my communication clear? Was I authentic? Like, I think that's where, you have to get a little bit honest with yourself and stop and ask yourself these difficult questions. Am I achieving all these things? And I don't know if all leaders are doing that, Gerry.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And for sure, everything you said, super important. You have to be self-reflective on if you and your organization are doing the right things. But, that part of that responsibility needs to be a shared responsibility with your leadership team as well. And, you need to create an environment that, I guess this comes back to, one of the pieces that you mentioned up front as far as the cultural piece and, the way the organization operates, is you need to give them permission to be able to critique that stuff. It needs to be a safe environment. You need to be able to hear the bad along with the good. And so, if you don't have that kind of communication and afford people in your organization the ability to be able to do that, then you're missing something big time. And I'm not sure I necessarily mentioned that as one of the leadership qualities up front, but for sure I would add that to the list. You need to be able to be vulnerable from that perspective. And I don't mean, vulnerable kind of sounds dramatic. It's not, it's not a personal thing. You just need to give people the opportunity to provide feedback. And sometimes it's not good, it happens.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think when you think about, your team and giving them permission, a lot of that is, trusting them as well. Like, you've hired them for a reason. But if you're not truly connected and engaged with them authentically, the feedback you may get may be just what you want to hear. And that's where I think when leaders can truly connect, they're vested with their team, they're going to get that good and the bad. And that's the only way where really growth can happen and change can come about. So sometimes it's just, I'll tell you what you want to hear because you know what? I don't feel that you even care about me. But if there's a connection there, I'm going to say, you know what, Gerry? I'm going to give you some constructive feedback that's actually going to have an impact on you.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that as a leader is important to do, because when you end up assuming senior positions, people treat you differently, and not a good or a bad thing. They just do. It just happens, and there are going to be people in the organization for whatever reasons that are going to be very much like that, and it's not a malicious thing. They just want to be able to engage with you, and they'll tell you what you want to hear. You have to find the voices in the organization of the people that are comfortable to tell you the truth. And it takes work. And thinking of the current situation and how leaders are engaging with their teams, I don't know how I would do that in this environment. In the old environment, when you could walk around, I mean, there's ways to pressure test that and find those voices. It's much easier to do. How do you do that over Zoom? I'm not sure. So that's certainly one big challenge of today. But that was an important piece for me as a leader of an organization. It's to have relationships outside your leadership team, because certainly within the leadership team, I think most of the teams that I operated with, people felt comfortable and could speak openly. I mean, that's part of setting the pace. You set the rules. So, you do that with them and you give them the permission to be able to do that with you. A little more challenging to do in other parts of the organization, but certainly an important piece.
Just to build off what you said about, relationships outside of the business, you started at the individual contributor level and you've gone all the way to the top. So I'm sure at some point your relationships have changed. So maybe you went from friends to colleagues to then, being their manager or their director. So can you give us some insights as to if someone's, new to management now and they're in that same role? Like, how do you balance, being chummy one day to having to pull them in and maybe having a difficult conversation the next day?
Yeah, I would tell you that was the hardest part for me, because I grew up, although I worked for three different organizations, I never changed companies. I started at Abbott, we were spun off, and then we were acquired. So there were many people through my career that I grew up with, and people that you reported into, people that you were peers with that ended up reporting into you at some point in time. And I think the word that comes to mind for me is managerial courage. I mean, you need to do what's right. I can think of a number of situations of people that I was very close to, very friendly with, and that at some point in time you had to have harder conversations, and it was hard. There's a lot of sleepless nights when you go through those kinds of situations. But I tried to be professional. I tried to be honest. I tried to be unemotional. I tried to be factual. I gave people chances. Maybe that's kind of overstating it, but you need to be fair with people, and irrespective if you were friends or not friends, you need to give people feedback and give them a chance to correct the issues that potentially needed to be addressed. But you need managerial courage in those situations. I mean, you have to do what's right for the business, but treat people fairly and honestly, and give them an opportunity to correct whatever issue might be needing correcting.
I love that word managerial courage. And I think it means a lot more than today than it did in the past, because, we need to be courageous and we're doing some things for the first time, right? Just like you were saying, how do you connect with people in a virtual environment? How do you build trust? How do you motivate them to do something that, is difficult to do? And I think, being courageous, doing the right thing, and just knowing at the end of the day, like, it's not easy, but if, you have to own that decision. You've factored everything that goes into it, and then you have to be okay with it.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to balance there, but managerial courage is a big element of being successful. But you have to be compassionate at the same time. It's you have to be able to be able to say and do the things that are required, but in a professional and compassionate way. I think those pieces are all kind of intertwined within managerial courage.
Yeah, and I think if you know the person and they know what you're about, that's going to come through, that you are compassionate, and that it's not, you're not taking it lightly, but you have to do this, versus somebody who isn't as connected. They may take it a little bit harder because there's no sincerity there. There's not a level of understanding that Gerry factored everything in, and he still had to execute this way. And I know Gerry, and I know he's fair, and I know he prides himself on integrity. It might make that decision a little bit more easier to swallow.
Yeah, it could be. You would hope so, but the circumstances are what they are. It doesn't make it any less easy to do. But nonetheless, you got to do what you have to do.
Yeah. So, Gerry, working in healthcare, kind of pharma companies, we know it's a very highly regulated environment, very high in compliance, and governed by Health Canada and FDA. And just even explaining that, you get the sense it's very a rigid environment, working environment. So, how did you balance your approach, leading people and making these difficult decisions by leveraging both, hard and soft skills?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, first of all, you have to operate with a high level of integrity, right? Because a lot of the responsibility that we have as an organization flows both ways. And there's things that happen in the organization that you're required to report. And certainly there's structure within the regulatory policy framework that you have to respect as well. And how that impacts your organization is part of we talked a little bit earlier about one of the attributes of strong leadership is thick skin. There's a lot of things that flow into the organization, both from the corporate office and externally, and from the regulators, that you have to decide what you let flow through the organization, you deal with at a senior level or your level or at the corporate level, as opposed to letting flow through the whole organization and stressing the entire organization. So very often, you have to balance those issues in how you engage the organization to be able to communicate those things when required. I know, like, we've worked together, we've spent time at Hospira together, and there was a period of time both on our device side of our business and on the injectable drug portfolio where there were some quality issues that needed to be addressed. I mean, that we were quite fortunate, and I had a lot of confidence in the organization, the corporate organization, that we were doing the right things. That certainly helps a lot in how you end up communicating into the organization what the issues are, because you're not just communicating what the issues are, you're communicating resolutions and managing the organization from a timeline perspective. So I think transparency from that perspective was very important and very called for, to be able to continue engaging people, right? And so we were doing the right things, and in those situations, you were also setting up your business to be a stronger entity coming out of it by addressing those pieces. So again, communication is a big part of how you end up doing that. But deciding what and when to communicate, I'd say, is probably the finer balance in how to engage the organization.
Yeah, lots of great points there, Jerry. And you're right. We did work together, and I do remember those. There's still some scarring moments, but we got through it. Um, and I think what you said there is really important. It's just knowing where you're at now, and it's difficult, but the decisions you make now are going to determine how the success beyond all this. So it's important to almost just separate yourself from what's going on and still be future driven. That says, yes, it's kind of, we're going through the pain now, but the gain that's going to come from it is going to catapult us in a different direction. And I think that's, it's harder to feel that in the moment. But I think to help make that easier to take is just that level of transparency that you said. And, when you're transparent and you let people know exactly what you're, well, not everything, but as you said, you filter how much you're going to share with them and at what time, but just they feel that they're part of it then. And I think then when you are communicating, you have them like they'll go where you need them to go because they feel that they're part of it. It's kind of change management, but they also trust you because you're sharing like exactly what they need to know, and that gives people
Yes, yeah,
comfort.
agreed. There's a lot of parallels to the conversation we had earlier about communicating on an individual basis. And I think I mentioned to you finding the voices that'll feel comfortable and you give permission to give you feedback on what's going on in the organization. And very similarly, this is kind of a similar set of circumstances, but with a broader audience, right? You're communicating what the potential issues are, you're providing feedback to the organization, but you're also giving them the solution. How are we going to be when we come out of this? And the strength of the organization and the impact and hopefully the benefits that come out of it. Then that's the feedback loop with the organization. And
Hmm.
so it's communication obviously is a big part of the core of how you engage to be able to do that.
And just what you shared there, Jerry, it takes me back to where we opened of just setting the pace and pausing. And it sounds like just what you explained. That's what you're doing, right? You're setting the pace. you're evaluating, you're testing, but you're pausing at the same time to, check in, make sure that the direction is okay, that the people are, the communication is clear, everyone's going in the right direction. So it seems like just what you shared in those fundamentals are kind of woven through a lot of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. It's certainly a very important part. Setting the pace, engaging, setting expectations, obviously, because those things that are very challenging to work through. But giving people the understanding of what you're doing, how you're engaging the different parts of the organization to address the issues, and on what timeline and what the expected outcomes are. So yeah, very very important part of engaging your team.
So, just building on where we're talking about whole leadership and the hard and the soft skills, can you talk to me a little bit about the program that you implemented with the head, heart, and guts, and maybe why you chose to bring that in, and a little bit about it so that others can, if they haven't heard about it, can understand, its impact?
Yeah, it was actually so it was a Hospira corporate initiative, leadership initiative, and it was based around head, heart, and guts. I think I don't remember the name of the gentleman that wrote the book, but it was the same guys that wrote Why CEOs Fail. I think I'm pretty sure that was the other big bestseller that they had written, and I think the way they framed it was head, heart, and guts was the antidote of how to make it work, and it was all based around whole leadership. And as leaders, many leaders are screwed in the head, the analytics, the ability to analyze data and translate that into whatever actions are required within the organization. But there, but that's only partial leadership. Whole leadership needs to engage heart and guts. I mean, guts to me is ties back to the managerial courage discussion that we ended up having. And that's very much around decision making, whether it's people, organizational structure related, whether it's around business issues and making decisions on go forward, on pull back, or making decisions to do things with having incomplete data. And the heart is really engaging the organization with some compassion, with some empathy, because not everybody in the organization is going to look at things from a fact based view. A lot of people are going to be impacted from the perspective of what's going to happen to my job. Am I still going to have a job? Like, you have to be able to show some compassion. How is my world going to change? People have different views, so you have to have an understanding of the different levers that are required of you to be able to be a whole leader. And so, at least, I'm not a consultant, I'm not an academic, but those were for me the key takeaways from head, heart, and guts, and the ability to apply them from a leadership perspective to the organization.
Well, I can attest to that. In my time there, I remember doing our performance objectives and seeing these words. And so just I think the importance of language, because I at the time probably would have been more head focused as well. But the minute I was forced to think about things from a heart perspective, I just got a completely different, I looked at it through a different lens. And whether it's a lens through my customers, this is where empathy comes in, my colleagues, other departments in the organization. And I can honestly say I would never have considered their point of view or their thoughts before had I not seen, just I've been prompted by this word. And then even the guts, sometimes it's like, do you, all this talk, are you going to actually execute on this? You can plan until you're blue in the face, but do you have the guts to execute? So I feel that the language that was introduced at that time really had an impact on me then. And I just think it's, I remember just writing my responses and just trying to make them really balanced, but it wasn't through effort. They organically were balanced because, when you think about them, like you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're entirely right. And, having the ability to know where you're oriented from a leadership perspective is a hard thing to do. I mean, the head thing is relatively easy just because that's the way we grew up and that's the way we're taught and that's the way we end up executing from a business perspective. I mean, the guts one is easy to identify, maybe a little harder to do, but that one's easy to understand, at least in my mind, if you've got a gap there. The hard one is the difficult one for me. And I think to a great degree it ties back to the active listening discussion that we had earlier. Trying to understand what people are telling you and putting yourself in their shoes and understanding the impact of whatever you might be executing from a business perspective and how it impacts them, and obviously with the goal of being able to engage them somehow. The hard one is it takes practice. It takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that one is the less natural out of all of them. But I love what you said because think about the awareness that it takes to even recognize. Like, I think most people would be strong in that heart or or sorry, the head and that left brain. But when you think about, as a leader, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and that comes through self awareness, and then really honing and saying, what do I need to do to get better? So, this is kind of where we can add on here the vulnerability piece and look at the heart, because we can throw data at something, but if we don't connect with people and get that emotional underlying feeling that they're having, they're not going to respond to us in an authentic way. So, Gerry, what would you say to leaders? And I would say a lot of leaders would fall into this category, but that are still head driven and kind of that old mentality way of thinking. And we've always done it this way. And maybe the heart is fluffy or just weak. Or what advice or what tips would you share with them to kind of hone in and really focus, lean into the heart?
Yeah, well, I would tell you probably the best thing to do is do a 360 feedback. Self awareness is one thing, but if you have blind spots, your blind spots are going to impact your self awareness. So, being able to identify those gaps it's a hard thing to do. And especially in critical situations, because that's when those skill sets are required, and that's likely the most difficult time to be able to think, okay, I need to tap into a different means of communication here than what my default might be. So if you have the opportunity, 360s are the best thing to do, of your leadership team, of peers, people that you report into, people that report into you, and get honest and open feedback that are structured around head, heart, and guts, and identify where those gaps are, like specific situational analytics that are able to tell you that, hey, you do really well here, but in this particular situation, whatever that situation might have been, sharing a little more heart would have been a much better way to engage the organization than just giving me all the facts. Show a little compassion and understanding of how it impacts me, and choose your words and actions accordingly. So 360 feedback is a great way to be able to do that. I mean, your leadership team as well. And if you really bought into the concept of head, heart, and guts, and that was a big thing in the Hospira world, and in fact Pfizer ended up adopting it as well. I'm not sure if they're still using it. Get the book, read the if your heart is really what you want to develop, read some of those pieces, and then try and identify a 360 feedback. Make it part of your leadership team so that you all support each other in those areas, so that you have an active feedback loop. So those would probably be the bigger things for me. That as far as if people are wanting to adopt the methodology and develop the whole leadership piece as opposed to partial leadership, I 360 is hugely important.
I love that. So leaders, if you're looking to improve self-awareness, start with that 360. And I love that you said the situational, Gerry, because 360 is kind of that, 30,000 view, but just honing in on the situation to even, a particular conversation or something where they can replay it back in their mind, and almost like, it's almost like one-on-one coaching, and you're observing. And just 'cause sometimes we live in, the subconscious all the time, and we're doing it unaware. But if you can bring them back to almost a more, particular time and place, they might be able to go, and even understand what triggered that or why they're doing that, because only then can you start working backwards to unraveling it, right? And I think that helps in the ownership too, when you can pinpoint it. It's like, I see this happening. Therefore, there's a bit of an accountability and an ownership there, because you're not telling me. You've painted a clear enough picture. I see when it's happening, and then I can start doing something about it.
Agreed. Agreed. I mean, the feedback loop is very important, and I mean, if you can get that feedback, it is a gift.
Absolutely. It's just sometimes people, they're afraid to ask for it because they don't want to know. They don't want to hear what's really in there, right? But I think when you get vulnerable enough and you want it bad enough, you're ready to hear and then do something about it. So, Gerry, a little bit about culture now. So, when you're making strategic decisions, what place does culture? Are you thinking about how is this going to have an impact on the culture? Does that enter your mind when you're making these high level decisions?
Um, I'm not, well, certainly there's a link between the two. I think the bigger part for me from a cultural perspective was connected to the pace that you set for the organization, the permission that you provide to the organization to interact on an open basis, the people that you hire and promote and develop within the organization. I mean, to me, the leadership team was hugely important. I mean, there was a way, for sure. Everybody has a default in the way that they like to manage and operate. Um, the leadership team really needs to embody that, and I mean, and I don't mean necessarily that everybody needs to be the same. I mean, you certainly need complementary skill sets within the organization to be able to cover the full bandwidth of what's required to operate a successful organization. But the openness, the mindset, I think that's an important element, to be able to engage. It can't just be you, it has to be the leadership team, and it needs to flow through the organization. And those were important pieces for me, from a cultural perspective. Like I had worked when I started at Abbott, and Abbott, and I don't mean to say this in a derogatory way, because the organization was a wonderful organization, and all organizations evolve over time. But when I had first started there, it felt like a very command and control type of environment. It certainly wasn't the case when we spun off, and created Hospira. The organization had evolved, and maybe it was required at that point in time. I was operating obviously at a very junior entry level perspective, but it felt very, what's the word, almost military type discipline in how things worked in the organization. And so, when you have an opportunity at latter stages in your career, that wasn't the kind of environment that I wanted to have my businesses operating in. And I was fortunate to have the flexibility to be able to do that. And I guess to a great degree, the organizations that we were reporting into were much more open minded as well in how to engage. So I don't know, those are kind of as I reflect on culture and how we ended up impacting culture, at least from a higher level perspective, those are the things that come to mind.
I think it's great that you drew upon kind of what you didn't like at the beginning and making a change, saying like this is something that I don't want to carry forward and I'm going to be intentional with the culture or with what I'm asking because I know I didn't enjoy this. Chances are my team's not going to enjoy it, as well. And I think a lot of that goes against what other people, feel at some point. It's like, well, this is the way it's always been. So we're just going to do this. And I just think as a leader, this is your invitation to bring you into it, like what you believe, what you had in the past and you didn't enjoy. This is a turning point for you, to really show your team like this. There's changes. It's possible.
Yeah, I would tell you there's one thing that you mentioned there that I wanted to mention earlier and neglected to do so is, adopting this learning mindset throughout your career has been and should be, a very important element of how you evolve. And there are two ways to be able to do that. I mean, there's multiple ways, but specifically through role modeling people, and mentorship. I mean, there are people that I have looked up to in my career for different things that I thought they were very capable of doing that, I tried to fashion myself around those specific things that you'd say, wow, I wish I was able to do that as well as they were able to do that, and try and learn from that perspective. But equally something, and I don't know why, it was just the way my head is screwed together. I also looked at people that did things in a way that I thought, man, I never want to do that. And you learn from that perspective as well. You build boundaries around the things that you're allowing yourself to execute from a leadership perspective, and creating boundaries in areas that you don't want to cross, that you wouldn't want to do that. And so, that's an effective way of learning as well, crossing off the things that you don't want to do. And that was an important piece to me. I mean, you spend a lot of time at work. I want to have fun at work. I always loved coming to work. I loved the people I worked with. I loved the things we were working on. And it was fun. I didn't want it to be a chore to go to work. And so I guess you're fortunate enough that you were operating at a level that you could influence the organization in such a way. But that was an important part to me. And I guess that to some degree ended up influencing the culture and how we operated as an entity.
Yeah, and I can attest to that, Gerry, that it did transcend, but you're one person, right? So you also have to, your leadership team needed to embrace that same message, right? Because you can't make that change on your own. So I feel that, it did. It was fun to come to work. So your intention did, trickle down to the organization, which is great to see. I love that point you said about looking at things or the way somebody may have maybe doing it differently than you. And, I can say now I would do that. Back in the day, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I just think when you think about diversity and just understanding, like, why are they doing that? Because what it does is I think it shines a light on us and that we play a little bit in our comfort zone. And when we can kind of go into that conscious brain and go, I wonder what would happen if I did it this way. And then we're open to trying new things and getting results. It's basically the definition of insanity. We're going to try new things and therefore get different results. But I feel we surround ourselves with mini me's, like-minded people, and it's like once you can introduce diversity, you're going to see things in a completely different lens. So I just think it's really great to look at. And you may not adopt what they're doing, but just kind of to understand why are they taking that approach. And what it does is increase your awareness that, like, why am I always taking this approach?
Yeah, agreed. I like the way you said that. And it sounds a little cliche-ish, but you hear lots of people say it, is that growth really happens in the areas that make you feel uncomfortable. So if you're always operating in your comfort zone, you're not necessarily pushing the limits of how good you can be, and seeing other people do things differently. I mean, we were very fortunate who worked for amazing organizations. I think back over the 30 years, the number of people that I had the opportunity to work with, there were some awesome, awesome leaders. And so, it was easy to look to people and say, wow, I want to get good at that. I want to be able to do that like him or her. And so, if you operate with that mindset, that's the growth piece, right? And so it's fun to do.
I love that. I love that. And I think that's a great place to end. Growth mindset. Keep honing your skills, keep sharp, whether it's listening to podcasts, reading a book. But I think, if you're applying methodologies and thinking of the 90s and the 2000s, it's just nothing's the same anymore. And people aren't going to respond to the old tactics of what worked in the past. So just to kind of recap, so we talked about, leadership as a whole. Then we talked about whole leadership. So really adopting that head, heart, and guts, and then a little bit on culture. So Gerry, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and your experience in terms of leadership. And if anybody wants to follow you, is there a way they can do that?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I do get on periodically. So if anybody has an interest in reaching out, I'd be more than happy to do so on LinkedIn.
Okay. And just before we leave, if there's leaders now that are just looking for, I want to get started, I want to be more strategic in my decision making, but I also want to factor in, myself, the team and what it's going to have on them and the culture. Is there two or three things that just you could say, like I would focus here in those early stages?
Yeah, I would say from the discussion we've had, the three most important things for me. We talked about a lot of things, but if I could summarize the three nuggets that I think would be good guideposts from a leadership and career development is, planning can be done at any level. It's not just a senior executive level exercise. When I was a rep, I planned my territory. When I was a product manager, I planned my brands. And you have to be connected to the organization, but you can do it at every level. Those plans, the senior plans in your organization can drill down to the lowest level. Do it. It's a great discipline to get used to doing, and it provides some good guideposts in how you manage whatever you're managing. I'd say adaptability. The world is changing very quickly. I Sorry if it sounds cliche-ish, but it's the reality. It's happening all around us. So being adaptable, things are going to change. There's new technologies, acquisitions, and spin-offs. That's a normal thing. Downsizing is a normal thing. So, getting good at that stuff and being able to adapt quickly as those things change, especially for young folks, you have a lot of runway in your career. Get used to doing that. That's going to be a big part of your life. And I would say the last thing is the whole head, heart, and guts and whole leadership. If you really have an interest in developing yourself from a whole leader perspective, find out where your blind spots are. Figure out how to do it, whether it's a 360, whether it's through informal feedback with people that you operate with. Give people the permission to give you that feedback and practice it. Be conscious of it and practice it, and create a feedback loop so that you understand how you're doing from that perspective. So I think those three things would probably be the bigger pieces from the discussion we've had.
Thank you. Those are three great tips for anyone looking to implement them immediately. So, Gerry, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate the insights you shared with us, and great to see you.
Thank you. You too. It was a pleasure being here. Have a great day.